Okay, we can start the first webinar of the series EUPRERAtalks. First of all, welcome to everybody. I'm Stefania Romenti, and I want just to spend a few words for introducing the guests today, but also for sharing with you the aim of these webinars. Last February within EUPRERA, we conducted a membership survey, and we have seen that some of our members said that they are not sure to know very well who are the other members and which are the researches, the publications, and the projects within which the other members are involved. So the aim of these webinars, the main aim, the most important aim of this webinar is just to share knowledge about what our members are doing, and so which are the latest publications, the most important researches within which they are involved, and also try to stimulate debates and discussions, because as you know, we have an annual conference, but during the days of our annual congress, we are not able to discuss with all the attendants of this conference, because the agenda is often very crowded, and we have also a rigid agenda. So our members also asked to have more opportunities to discuss, to discuss about topics, some important topics, to discuss about researches, and to share knowledge, because it is also important, and they want to discuss in a flexible way, so without the timing constraints that our annual congress has. So that's the reason why we started with this initiative. We have more than 50 persons who are registered to this webinar, so I think that the starting is very good. And I wanted to welcome the guest speakers today, Professor Laura Illia, University of Fribourg, Professor Elanor Colleoni, IULM University, and Professor Katia Meggiorin from Stern Business School at New York University. So thank you so much for being here today, and I leave you the floor. Laura?
Yeah, thank you very much, Stefania, for the warm welcoming. Let me share with you the slides. Are you seeing the slides? Great. I'm Laura Illia. I'm really very happy to be able, and I'd like to thank EUPRERA and Stefania for giving us the opportunity to present our work here in this setting. As you can see, we give you welcome in 4 different languages, which are the languages of the research team of the project we are going to present to you today. The study I'm going to present is a study that I developed together. We have been developing together with Elanor Colleoni, my co-letter, who unfortunately he was sick today, so he had to cancel his active participation. He's anyway connected online because it was interesting at least to be able to follow. Michael, please recover soon. And Katia Meggiorin that Stefania has already introduced. So the agenda, we will spend, the way we structure the webinar is this one. So we have decided to devote about 20-25 minutes to the presentation of this study that we recently published in Business and Society, which is the focus of the webinar. But then we also thought that it was nice to have broader reflections that Elanor was able to develop from her viewpoint, partially also on behalf of the team, but from her viewpoint on the implication of this study for public relations management and business and society in general. And then we will open for a Q&A session at the end that maybe questions that you devote to the study that I presented on behalf of the whole team, or on questions on the reflection that Elanor has proposed today for the webinar. The last part will be managed by Katia Meggiorin, and so she will moderate this Q&A. She will make sure we have foment the discussion. If you have any question during the webinar, you can also post your questions in the chat, and Katia will take note of that, and then she will select those that are the most interesting to be discussed at the end of the webinar. But let's start about what is the starting point of the study. No, the study which is about, which is the one that we just published in Business and Society. So the context of this study in which this is inserted, clearly it's, I think we have all been witnessing the growing, highly contested industry that banks have become over the years, and this clearly has a long start, and 2008 with the subprime crisis was an important turning point. Probably banks were not loved even before by publics and people, but after 2008, given that they are considered to be somehow responsible to the economic crisis that has struck Europe and worldwide, they have started to be more hated as institutions, no? And the whole industry has been put into question. And me personally, I was living in Madrid while this has happened, and I was living 500 meters from Plaza del Sol in Madrid, where I could really go and interact with the participant of the movement of Indignados. And for me, what was striking is that clearly this movement, they were, as you can see, they considered that was not nice, that money was given to recover banks at that point, and democracy was, this link between politics and banking industry was really put into discussion, and the indignation of this relationship, indignation of many other things that were going on at the time in relating with the economic crisis. And what was particularly interesting was to see the broad and very diverse viewpoints on the claims against the banks that were coming out there in the crowd. And clearly, of course, this became much more visible when the Occupy Wall Street movement really took off, which is after the Indignados movement. We all remember that. And this is a movement that really, exploded worldwide, and the Occupy US then became Occupy from different countries. And of course, Italian is my mother language. Of course, I was following the Occupy Italy kind of manifestations, no? And I really could see that this is a worldwide phenomenon. And so, that's how I said, of course, as a Swiss, I'm interested in understanding banking industry in particular, but I could really see these were the years where something was going on in terms of the legitimacy of this industry and banks in this industry. So I had the chance to ask money at the UniCredit and universities foundations, that they granted a grant to work from 2014 to 16 on in buying data on social media conversations on different banks in Italy. And then I applied in order to enlarge this study at the Fundación BBVA, which is a bank in Spain, and they allowed us to buy new data and also data outside the banking industry. So to really analyze this phenomenon of these online movements and how they denigrate banks and other institutions relating with the similar issues of banks. So as you can see, this is a project that is inserted into a research project that is more than 10 years long, right? And of course, we have been developing different studies in this setting, and some are on the question if does social media legitimacy matter for business? And then others were more under which conditions does social media legitimacy impact business broader legitimacy? And then other studies go more into how this impact is creating and by whom. And so over the years, we have been working on different papers. The first one was led by Michael and Elanor. They invited Katia and myself that had this data on one bank. So to really analyze, does this legitimacy in social media, is it different from the legitimacy of other institutional actors? And then with Elanor and Katia, we developed a study really to analyze how these discussions online have an actual impact on business outcomes, in this particularly outcomes of a bank. Then we developed the studies that were really willing to understand, but these words, discussions online, do they have an impact on the broader legitimacy of the banks and of organizations? And here we analyze in the study that we're presenting today really the discussions and this influence while there is a lot of volume of social media conversations. And then in another study we analyze that after the social media scandal exploded, when the volume is not high, and we were interested to see if this is a more what are the conditions that makes anyway an influence when the volume of the social media posts were not there anymore. And then there are a number of studies that I'm conducting with some colleagues, which go more into, you know, of these most impactful judgments that citizens throw and that delegitimates banks. How do they discredit, how they are built? In another study, and this is with Castello Zamparini, with Helms and Michael and Ludovico and Caserta, we analyze more who is behind, who are these crowds, how do they aggregate and activate? And in another study, we try to look at who is beyond and if they really have a temporary or more a long-term impact. So this is to make you understand the whole context, no? The motivation beyond this study that we're going to present, and how this inserts into a broader research agenda that we as a group, we have around this topic on banking, legitimacy of banks and social media relevance into that. So the study I'm presenting is this one, and what is academic debate? We really insert this study. What are the key concepts and our research question? So here it's important that I provide you some definitions. So organizational legitimacy, the way we define in this study is the social acceptance of organizations. And clearly social media, from this study, we consider that they have an important role in building legitimacy, because in less influential individuals now, they really, through interactions via microblogs, which are social media, really they have somehow the power to broadcast their different viewpoints, no, heterogeneous evaluations, and give birth to these legitimate struggles, right? And debate around if an institution organization is legitimated. And they do it, the individuals do it through what is called a discursive legitimacy, which takes place online. So the debate we are trying to contribute in this paper is, do social media evaluations have a meaningful impact on business? No, and there are some studies that they say that they do, right? And here, mainly if we to give an overview of all the studies, what they do from one side, they say, well, social media do have an impact, and there are some a priori characteristics of social media content that allow this impact, such as the extreme emotionality, the visual characteristic of the message. There is a process of moralization beyond that. And then there are other studies that say, well, there are some exogenous ex post characteristics relating with the discursive context where these social media conversations takes place. And so what matters is not the characteristic of the post, but how this post is inserted into a broader discourse. And here there are some studies that show that this creates an impact either on the outcomes or on broader legitimacy. But then clearly, you know, a debate, it's a debate, and there are other studies that consider that actually maybe they put into question if really social media have this power to have an impact on businesses. And here, you know, recent studies have really contended the contrary, that actually it is very difficult, if not impossible, when all these social media conversations are there, to really have a visible, clear frame and one voice coming out. There are a lot of heterogeneous viewpoints and claims, and I could really see that in the Plaza del Sol, where the indignados were there. They really had heterogeneous viewpoints on why hating and discrediting a specific institution. And in this variety of viewpoints, it's difficult to really understand and process all this information, right? And it's difficult to assimilate all these heterogeneous stimuli, also because there is a fragmented media landscape, many social media, many microblogs. And so basically, even though social media, in principle, they provide possibility of individuals to influence businesses, because of the dispersion of the fragmentation of media landscapes and the high volume of heterogeneous claims, not a clear voice comes out. And so at the end, it's easy that this is more a form of slacktivism, so a very temporary booming discussion on an institution, but then at the end, the repercussions on the business seems to be not as important as other studies suggest. And so we joined this debate, and we argue that it's important to look really further into the heterogeneous evaluations to really understand how do they reach over time a significant critical mass of volume and convergence. Because if it's true that the big volume of social media conversations might create dispersion and heterogeneity, at some point over time, there is a convergence. And in this paper, we analyze how the conditions for this convergence and for this clear voice to emerge. And so we ask, how do heterogeneous legitimacy evaluations in social media converge and influence news media legitimacy? So our hypothesis and our conceptual frameworks is as it follows. To answer our research question, we built on extant research that shows how convergence in social media happens progressively and discursively. And basically these studies, they say that when people discuss online in microblogs, they co-associate their own content with the one of others. So it's never that people just simply diffuse the other people's content verbatim, but they really build new meaning while they link their own message with the one of others. And this happens through the form of an hypertext, which is a text composed of blocks of text and electronic links where people interact one another. And even though hypertext might potentially bring to dispersion, because of course, more people come, more associations are going on in this hypertext, more infinite dispersion there might be, we argue, based on other studies, that actually convergence is possible. And it's possible when there is a specific condition that we call refracting attention in the paper, which is when a high volume of individual evaluation discursively twists, change their meaning through the same aggregative frames. So what is refraction? And the definition of refraction comes from other studies, and in particular a study that Elanor has been leading and that was recently published in 2021 on how digital collectives discuss around topics of organizations. And refraction happens when people co-discuss things in a discursive hypertext. They twist the meaning of their content because they reappropriate the content of others for their own purposes, to also particularly self-publicize themselves. And so it's a bit like refraction is like, if you need to look at it as a metaphor of a wave changing direction when it passes through a new surface. In chemistry, is a social media evaluation twists and changes, figuratively speaking, its meaning when it passes from one block of the hypertext to the other, meaning when it starts to be linked with meaning with content of other people. And in this example here on the right, for example, Monty, it's one of the hashtags in this data set we had. Here you see there is high volume because it's a big node in the social network, semantic network, but no refracting attention because it has not been twisted as a meaning, right? Whereas you have other hashtags like Profumo, like PD, like others that in fact they were co-occurred with other hashtags, and that's how the meaning twisted of these specific original hashtags. Why refraction is important? Because it allows really identifying the few relevant legitimacy claims and judgments that are important, right? And this comes from the Pareto rule, and the Pareto rule is a rule in science that say that for 20% of effort, most often you might have 80% of the results, and the 20% of the results might come out from 80% of efforts. And what does that mean? It means that it's important to identify those paths that really create the impact, and probably those posts are only 20% of the posts that are around there in these big discussions that are taking place. And some previous studies show that the proportion can even be 10%, 90. And so what we argue here in the paper is that the most refracted legitimacy judgments that receive the most refracted attention are those that are uptaken by news media, and therefore are those that really influence the broader media discourse on this specific bank that we analyze. And given that is a discursive process, it takes place over time, and therefore our hypothesis is that legitimacy evaluation need to reach a tipping point of refracted attention over time to influence media legitimacy. So what is a tipping point? It's a change in state in the relationship between legitimacy expressed in social media and legitimacy expressed by news media. When refracted attention you see here in the figure on the left, it's there, it starts to be constructed, co-occurrence happens, but didn't reach a tipping point. Probably the effect of the influence of social media and news media is not there because the refracted attention still didn't reach a specific point to create this Pareto rule, right? But then at some point, there is a tipping point of refracted attention that really allows to show that there is an influence, and the message from social media passes to news media. So it's from us, it's really a question of the moment in which the level of volume provided to an organizational issue creates awareness about it, and that refraction has been achieved in a visible way. So the methods we used to test our hypothesis was, first of all, the corruption case. We analyzed Montepaschi di Siena, which is an Italian bank that has been going through a scandal. scandal relates with the suspicious acquisition of Anton Veneta Bank. And over the years, you know, the company was under scrutiny by public attorneys, and in 2013 came out, but this investigation became public. And these are the years of our study in social media conversation, news media legitimacy. We analyze basically the year where the year before, we have data about the year before this scandal erupted, when the scandal became public, and the year after. And we were interested to see how basically the legitimacy that is put into question in social media is influencing news media legitimacy. So our data set is really two. No, we have Twitter. We choose Twitter because Twitter, it's social media that really allows people from different backgrounds, that are not even having a reciprocal relationship, to really connect through an hashtag to discuss openly about something. And so we downloaded data about Montepaschi Disegna with these keywords, and we had allowed about 2.5 million tweets. And then from the Factiva database, we downloaded with this keyword from the 3 major newspapers in Italy. We collected this number of articles, and which is on average 11 articles per week. The measures, we measure first, of course, news media legitimacy, which is our dependent variable. Here we use a lexicon designed by Lothran and McDonald. They analyzed news media tonality specifically, so we semi-automated this analysis of all the articles of news media. We were talking about quite 2,000 articles, so it was a lot. And here we categorize from -1 to +1 in terms of media tonality. Citizen sentiment in social media, we developed an automated machine learning technique, but we didn't use the same dictionary because we needed to build a dictionary. We needed to build a specific machine learning vocabulary to really analyze our social media data. And so we have 3 researchers that coded 10% of the whole data set. And based on this, we train an algorithm that through a library that allows to categorize as negative, neutral, and positive sentiment expressed in social media. And then to measure refracted attention, which is our threshold variable, these variables to understand the tipping point, we measure the frequency of all paired evaluations. And so we develop a semantic network analysis from a 2-node to a 1-node network. Basically, in our semantic network analysis, we have as nodes the content, and the links between the nodes are the retweets between the different actors. So different from social network, typical traditional social network analysis, the nodes are not the actors, but the content, in particularly the hashtags. And of course, for all measures, we calculated the average value per week, and we also normalized so to have standard deviation up to 1. The analysis we developed, this was a TVAR model, so threshold autoregressive model. So why we do that? So sentiment and news media, they have a nonlinear relationship. So because of course sentiment can be from -1 to 1, and also there might be some endogeneity into this data set because, you know, one might relate to the other, and there might be a third variable that might explain this relationship. Therefore, the TVAR model is the perfect way to analyze the relationship we are willing to analyze in our hypothesis. And in our case, basically the TVAR allows us to test the hypothesis that when refracted attention is low, there is no impact of social media on news media, whereas when refracted attention is high, so a new regime, when the tipping point is overcome, of refracted attention has taken place, then citizens' evaluation in social media impact on news media legitimacy. So what are the results? Here you can see that the TVAR confirms our hypothesis that clearly, you know, when the refracted attention is low, so when there is not so much co-pairing in social media conversations, news media legitimacy depends on itself. So, of course, news media, they copy each other, no? And so the legitimacy from some newspapers influence the legitimacy of newspapers the days after, the weeks after, and this is clearly the case when there is a low regime of refracted attention in social media. But when the tipping point is overcome of refracted attention, then is the citizen judgments in social media that influence news media legitimacy, which totally confirms our hypothesis. We developed the IRF function, which allows us to quantify, simulate how strong is this relationship, and also how it fades over time. And we could see, you have here on the right, the high regime of relating to the threshold of refracted attention. And you can see that the effect that we found takes place for 3 weeks after the tipping point, and which means that it's still able to influence up to 3 weeks after the effect took place. And then we went to see the tweets that exceeded this threshold of refracted attention, and we could see that only 7% of the hashtags and tweets in our dataset that are above this threshold. And this, I would say, even though it seems to be very low, it's consistent with this Pareto rule that in social media is a 10-90%. 10% of hashtags and tweets might create the spread of things, and it seems to be the case. And then we could see there are multiple heterogeneous evaluations linked, so more than 1,000 other tweets and co-pairing, so which shows that there is a lot of heterogeneity of viewpoints. So there is not a uniforming and focused one, but still very heterogeneous. And then we could see that who is beyond, at least in number of followers, we could see are really people that have fewer followers. And so elite bloggers and influencers are not part of those that really are related with these very powerful hashtags and tweets. This is just for you to show that we developed some alternative model. In particular, the reviewer in the reviewing process asked us to test an alternative model where we have a threshold just volume and not refracted attention. We can see that this is not impactful. And then we also did some controls to do some robustness tests. We basically retested our model by taking away the top users that have a high number of followers, just to make sure that our assumptions on who's beyond were correct. And you see the model stands very well. Our hypothesis is still confirmed. And then we also tried to take away those tweets that are the most high in volume, but not refracted. And you can see it still holds very well. I mean, findings are consistent. So what is the contribution, and what can we draw from this study? And so clearly, first, there is the influence of social media really has a lot to do with a tipping point, and in our case, a tipping point of refracting attention. So from our viewpoint, we believe the contribution here is that the debate has to move from, do social media have an impact on business? And we could see that some studies say yes and others no, to actually start to ask ourselves, when does this impact happen? And so maybe initially it does not, but then after a certain condition of a threshold that in our case was refracted attention, it becomes impactful. So if heterogeneity is a problem, it might stop to be a problem at some point because there is convergence. And when does that happen? It's an important question we all need to ask ourselves. And so start to think in terms of tipping point and critical mass of social media conversation is very important than just looking at per se social media conversations alone. Then another important implications we believe for theory on legitimacy is, to understand discursive legitimacy, so legitimacy that is occurring in social media. So far, many studies are focusing more on studying the dialogues, the micro level, the dyadic conversations, and we believe there is a lot of potential to really look at exploring the hypertext and the discursive context where these dyadic conversations take place. So to really see that only few frames help to co-situate the legitimacy of the cognitive legitimacy of individuals that they might have while they do this dyadic conversation into the larger discourse, coherent discourse that is taking place in social media. And we believe here there is a lot of really potential to contribute to the theory of legitimacy, the in-stage phase that Tost shows of the legitimacy process. And then clearly there is a methodological contribution. Not only we kind of show how to use semantic network analysis via the one mode, two mode network, but also how to operationalize convergence in legitimacy, right, with this measure of refracted attention. And in particularly, most importantly, probably, we have shown how the TVAR models helps to solve the problems of maybe endogeneity and the nonlinear relationship between social media and news media evaluations, but also how we can really analyze this tipping point. So that was all from my side on presenting on behalf of the whole team the work. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all my co-authors for the big efforts we have done through the years to make this paper published. We all have equally worked on this on this paper together. And if we could reach the quality, which I hope could be considered good quality of as a paper, it's really coming from everybody. Now I leave the word to Elanor, that she will develop her reflections on how our study has, you know, as an implication for public relations management and business and society in general.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. And yes, actually, let me share my screen just 1 second. And the reflection that I actually here are, are more about societal and business implications of what we found. And so first of all, and I will try to be brief because of course it's already super late. And just 1 second, let me move this one here, otherwise I can see. So the first one, which I think the implication of our study in terms more in societal terms refers to the new, what we call new media great transformation. So what we found, so far what we knew was this idea of the reverse agenda setting, right? So the idea that somehow social media were actually very powerful in like shifting the attention of news media, right? So this is what we knew already. But our studies, I think, and our results actually shows, sorry, just a second, okay, that instead, there is also, so not only news media are actually impacting, like social media can impact news media in terms of like shifting the attention, but also influencing the evaluations of news media about the target of social media price, which of course is a strong result, right? And implies somehow that it forces us like to rethink our idea of news media, because sometimes they are not as objective and as balanced as we might expect, right? But instead, we see they can actually be influenced by the discourses online, and this, I think, pairs with new findings on how news media are changing. New media content is actually increasingly emotional rather than rational, and so somehow we are seeing, I think, a great transformation in the way news media work. And of course, this for businesses implies that they have less control, even less control over the content on news media, right? Because originally we thought that instead news media were more balancing and also take into account the different voices. So this is, I think, the first very strong and critical contribution or implication of our study. The second one is what I presented here, just a few key learnings. I would say that, as Laura was showing, we actually been working like for 10 years, right, on this topic, on how actually social media are influencing business. So I tried to somehow put these key learnings, right, of all our studies. So the first one that we actually started to say many years ago is that actually influence in social media is mainly driven by content rather than individuals. And this was rather than powerful individuals. And this was already found more than 10 years ago by Kwak and other computer scientists. And so the key learning here for businesses is that they have focus more on creating and sharing attractive content rather than trying to targeting key influencers. The second learning that we can draw from all our studies and what also Laura presented for businesses is this idea that they should actually focus on content, but also somehow building around this content, not real like communities, loyal communities, but instead trying to aggregate what we call, and actually media communication scholars call public. So to somehow aggregate this temporary association around an issue or an interesting content that that can then make people share their own experience, right, and create somehow attention around the topic. The third implication is actually how to do this, right? So we want businesses to create a nice content and somehow think like more in terms of how to attract these temporary publics rather than loyal communities. So how they need to do this is by creating hashtags that are instead of thinking like before we use in terms of brand that is filled with a lot of meaning, right? They actually have to create hashtags that are more aggregative frames, and to do so they have to use this, what we also showed in the papers and in other papers that we have. They must take this form of anti-signifiers, so very vague terms that actually allow multiple interpretation, but also allows individuals to share their own experiences. So this technique has been widely used and for a long time used in political communication. For example, the Obama's political campaign on change, right? So change is an empty signifier that basically allowed to aggregate everybody that wants change, but without like having a clear definition of change. And this is why it's so powerful in aggregating individuals, right? And that's exactly what actually Dove, as an example here, was trying to do and did actually on their campaign on real beauty, where they actually asked individuals to share their own experience, their own understanding of what beauty is with the hashtag I'm beautiful because. And this is exactly a perfect idea of an aggregative frame that companies can use to create high quality content that can actually create publics and create attention around their own things. And the last learning is exactly what we actually were discussing with the tipping point. So this idea, because what we see also a lot about companies is that they actually think that social media is about monitoring, but actually what we show in this paper is actually that it is more about predicting, right, rather than monitoring and predicting. And in order to predict, somehow we need to understand the structure of the conversations and how it plays out, not only look at the sentiment, but at all these ingredients that we actually found along the years, right, that were impactful. So for instance, refraction, broadness, as in the chapters that Laura was mentioning before. And so the new algorithm that companies need to build are more like anomaly detection algorithms, right? So these algorithms that allows us to see, okay, we are reaching a sort of a tipping point, let's do something. So switching this mentality from monitoring to predicting. And I think that our paper really provides like the basic ingredients on how to do this. And that's it. Thank you. And yeah, I will leave the floor. Sorry, let me just stop sharing. Oh my God. Yeah. Laura, I don't know whether we want now to have, we have Katia, right?
Yeah, I can manage the Q&A session. Thank you, everybody. Thank you both for these nice presentations. We have already one question on the chat, and of course, I invite all the participants to raise your hand if you want, or add more questions to the chat as we go. So the question that we have right now is from Dennis, who is asking, to what degree do you think organizations should create frames instead of jumping into frames that already exist? So I think this is a question on specifically the Dove example, where the organization was creating the frame for people in social media to participate and to create a discourse, or whether, for example, in the case of Montepaschi that we investigated in our paper, whether the bank should have or could have entered that conversation and tried to twist it somehow in its favor, supposedly. So I think that's the question. And I will say, well, maybe Elanor can speak more on the topic, even that she has researched that topic in particular. But my intuition will be that probably both could be done, with the creation of the frame being slightly easier to do, as it is created by the company, and maybe applying this general framing is proven to help create a conversation. Twisting a conversation seems to be more challenging, as we mentioned, as Laura mentioned, along with the conversation, with her presentation, sorry. We are, now that we understood that there is a threshold beyond which conversation on social media can have an effect on media legitimacy, we are just now trying to go into understanding what about the characteristics of the tweets or the characteristics of this conversation have an influence? What is driving, what is creating the passage from a low refracted attention conversation to a high refracted attention conversation that has the potential of influencing the organization. So given our still limited knowledge on these characteristics, I would say that the changing of the frame may be at this time slightly more difficult to do it, to understand. But I want to give the word to Elanor or Laura if there is anything that they would like to add on this point.
Yes, no, I think that what you said is right. The fact that it's about discourse, so the power of discourse is that somehow you can shape it like on the go, right? So they can do both. Of course, the difference is that you create your own empty signifiers or aggregative frame when you want to actually create a movement, right? While instead, on the other way around, so maybe when you have actually a movement, like maybe against the company, then the power is that the company can actually try to shape, right, to jump in and shape the way actually this aggregative frame is articulated. So it goes both ways.
Yeah, and maybe here what I can add from a PR perspective and issues crisis management, stakeholder management, is that clearly if you have 0 frames around on yourself online before something like this happens, it's very difficult. You can really enter into any conversation. So that's why it's very important to do what Elanor was suggesting in her reflection, to be part of these digital collectives, discussions with them, and not just trying to build communities for marketing communication purposes relating to some specific frames that create loyal people, but really start to be in conversations with the different diffuse publics that are around there, and build what could be considered a kind of a relational capital that one develops by having this important social networks interactions before any scandal happens. Otherwise, it's very difficult that you can jump into any frame when this happens if you have been 0 present before and if you have 0 relational capital online, basically. So all these conditions really, that's why corporate comm and PR is very important today more than ever, because you need to communicate not only in the aftermath of a crisis or during, but really to have a very strong presence online beyond marketing communication purposes. And that's what really it's important to really be able to launch important frames and jump into new ones over time.
Thank you. I'll take a couple of minutes just to see if we have any more questions from the audience. So I'll give you just a little time to gather your thoughts. Otherwise, I can proceed and kind of show the limitation and future research that we see from moving forward from this study. Okay, and I'll. Okay, as we have not a question as of now, I'll go ahead and present some of the limitation and future research that we see originating from the study. Can you confirm it that you see my slides in full? Perfect. Okay. So starting with the limitations, as you may have guessed already from this presentation, this is a single case study, which allows us to go very deep into the understanding of the empirical setting and into the discursive dynamics that are taking place. However, the threshold that we are able to identify within this paper may be, we expect to find the same threshold in other empirical contexts. However, we also expect that there may be difference in the specific level of this threshold. So as a future research originating from this limitation, it could be interesting to observe how this threshold translates into for other organizations or into other cultural areas or even industries. Finally, and as a second limitation, we chose one dependent variable that we deemed appropriate to investigate the research question that we had. However, which is in particular how social media broadly, how social media can influence the organization. And we decided to use the media legitimacy as a dependent variable. But of course, the influence on the organization can be expressed on other variables as well. And it could also be expressed through other actors as well. So we could imagine investigating the impact of social media on other macro-institutional actors, such as regulators and governments, and see whether the same dynamic is taking place, or whether the dynamic there will be slightly different. And this leads me, this is very much linked to what we see as being some opportunities for future research for this study. First of all, as Laura also mentioned, it's a project that she is already pursuing. It's a research question that she's already trying to answer, and it concerns the characteristics of the tweets that may, or of any social media interaction for that matter, but the characteristics of that interaction that can lead to a high level of refracted attention. As a second venue, second path for future research, we also see the potential of looking at how the refracted attention influences organizations. As I mentioned before, we are looking specifically at the influence through media legitimacy, but of course we can expect the refracted attention to also influence the organization's strategies, its values, and maybe even changing the norms within the entire industry. So of course it will be very interesting in pursuing this kind of research to try to look at how refracted attention may be effective in changing any of these other three components very relevant for the organizational performance. Another venue for future research, again, here, Laura and Michael are already investigating this aspect as well, is trying to look at the actors behind the creation of high refracted attention. And here we kind of started looking into this direction within the paper as well. We were able to see that the effects that we find of the creation of the high level, the threshold of refracted attention is not dependent on the top users of Twitter. So the most followed Twitter users are not the one responsible for creating these high refracted attention tweets and conversations. So this is like the question of who are the actors that are able to create this high refracted attention conversation, and how do they do that? And finally, another opportunity for future research concerns the relationship between refracted attention and volume. As we explain in the paper and as we shown on the paper, these two dimensions are different. However, there's more investigation on how exactly they differ from each other. Our intuition is that there is a temporal relationship that sees volume preceding maybe refracted attention. So it's unclear whether we need volume in order for the conversation to potentially converge. And once it converges, we show that it has an effect on the media legitimacy of the organization. But how exactly is that relationship and how is that generalizable across other contexts as well? And that will open to a discussion of what's the accurate measure for social media influence on the organization. So which of these two measures are able to correctly register and measure the social media's ability to influence the organizations and their performance. And that concludes my little talk on the future research opportunities. And I don't see any more questions on the chat. So unless any participants would like to raise their questions, I think I'm pretty done with my little speech.
Yes, I think that we can conclude this webinar. So thank you so much, because I personally appreciate very much your presentation. It was a long time that I didn't listen to, to a presentation, so long presentation of a paper, of a research. So thank you so much for the timing that you dedicated to us. And thank you. Thank you also to all people who were connected.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye-bye.
At the next webinar. Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.